Welcome to Tales from the Bridge. Sue Burke joined us recently and we had a great conversation. As usual, we learned a lot from our guests, so we're very grateful to have Sue join us. Check out Sue's website, sueburke.site. She's got a blog, a lot of interesting stuff there, and you'll find out a lot about what Sue is up to and what's coming soon from books that she's writing. So, all right, let's make our way over to the bridge. First of all, I don't want to alarm anyone, but Sam and Sue, you both have plants right behind you.
I even have a bird of paradise here. Oh, you can't even see it. Oh, there it is.
There it is. Yeah.
It's enormous and probably running my life right now.
Well, the palm tree has a name. It's actually quite big. It's over 6 feet tall, and it's called a majesty palm. It comes from the swamplands, the wetlands of Madagascar. So it's named Swamp Thing.
That's a great name. I like that. Nice. Appropriate too, I think maybe. Okay, so we're pleased to have with us today critically acclaimed science fiction author Sue Burke. Sue is the author of several novels and novelettes, as well as more than 30 short stories. She is also an award-winning book translator. Many listeners will know Sue from her Semiosis book series. In fact, our book club is currently reading Semiosis this month, and it's also an Arthur C. Clarke Award nominee. It was great. I ripped right through it, and I've finished the second book already in the series, which is called Interference. So for those who haven't read her work, Sue does a wonderful job blending hard sci-fi with likable characters and lots of intrigue. The 2 books that I've read so far have been genuine page-turners. Last year, Sue published a new novel called Immunity Index, which I haven't read, but I'm interested in hearing all about today. So, Sue, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, exciting. So how are you? How are things?
I'm doing well. Right now I'm working on the 3rd book in the Semiosis series, the 3rd and final.
Oh, I'm excited about that.
It will be called Usurpation.
Oh, nice. Usurpation. I kept reading that it was a duology, and I kept thinking to myself, I want a trilogy, and I'm glad to hear that. That's great.
We talked Tor into it.
Can you give us
probably
any?
Wasn't difficult to do.
No, exactly. Is there anything you can say about it? I know you probably can't say too much, but
well, when you get to the end of the second book, Interference, you know that there is rainbow bamboo on Earth, and rainbow bamboo is an aggressive species, and they find themselves on Earth and just be themselves.
Yeah, I did finish it. I kind of went beyond the homework that we were to do with our book club, and I couldn't stop. I had to read the second one, and I got to that point and cliffhanger, and so I'm really glad to hear that book continues on. Rainbow Bamboo is a pretty awesome character too, so I mean, you're talking about your big palm behind you, either your swamp palm. What are your thoughts on sentience? Do you think that he's sentient behind you there?
Plants are very, very aware of their environment, and they know something is out there. They may not know me by name, but they're aware that there's things around them that affect their environment. And some are more aware than others in the sense that they manipulate us. A tomato is a good example, because tomatoes want their seeds to be spread. And this is true of a lot of plants. A lot of plants do this. So tomatoes can actually make it through our digestive system intact. So they want you to eat their fruit. And when the fruit is ripe and delicious, they turn a color so that you will know you should eat them. And we obey because we're hungry and we eat things, and they know that we will do that. So they're there. They know we're there, and they will communicate with us when it's convenient for them. And plants do a whole lot of, in fact, really nasty things to animals. There's a couple of orchids, bee orchids, and they need to have their pollen spread from one orchid to another. Orchids in general are horrible, horrible flowers and plants and mean and nasty. If someone gives you an orchid, they don't like you. So what the bee orchid does is it looks kind of like a female bee, and it smells kind of like a female bee. So the male bee comes and thinks it's going to get a female bee, and it doesn't, but it does get pollen on them. And then there's another female bee over there, and it goes there, and it delivers the pollen, and it never gets anything. I mean, most flowers, at least, they give you nectar, but this one is just a horrible, nasty tease, and it's tiring for the male bees, and orchids are horrible. Plants in general, nowhere out there, and they're not always kind to us. The semiosis, both editions of it, the plant on the cover, or there's this sort of tentacle-ish thing on the cover, and it is a carnivorous plant called a sundew. They grow around where all of us live, but they're very small, so they just eat small insects. But yes, there's hundreds of plants that will eat us.
And I thought that was some type of fern. That's a much more exciting story than just a plain old fern. And I love that how are those sorts of plants, were those kind of inspiring you for conceptualizing how a plant could be sentient, could outthink humans? Because you did a great job with that in semiosis and interference. Was that inspired by real plants?
The whole thing started a long time ago when one of my houseplants killed another houseplant. And at first I felt bad because I should have been paying attention. It was a vine and it wrapped itself around the other plant. And then a month later, another plant attacked another houseplant. And I caught it in time, but I thought that was suspicious. And I did some research and discovered that plants are really horrible and aggressive. And they have to be aggressive because they lead difficult lives. They do all sorts of things. They have a lot of abilities we don't necessarily realize that they can do because either we're used to them or we're just not paying attention. But any horticulturalist knows that plants have a lot of abilities and are not afraid to use them. They struggle every day. They know what's going around them. Trees, because they're big and strong, can actually remember things. And they will remember the weather from year to year because weather is very important to them. And it goes on and on. They can make any sort of chemical that they want. They can move. They can see to more or less degree. And sometimes it's really, really strange. There is a plant in Peru, and it's a vine. And to avoid being eaten or being noticed, because apparently it's a delicious thing to eat, when it's around another plant, it will try to look like that other plant. Now, how does it know that plant, what it looks like? And they thought, well, maybe scientists thought, well, maybe it's some sort of chemical thing, because they use a lot of chemicals to communicate with each other. Like they say, well, here, an insect is eating me, you should know this, and this is this kind of insect. And they can tell each other that. But so you have this vine. How does it know what the other vine looks like? So they tried growing it next to plastic plants. It looked like the plastic plant.
Wow.
So something very strange is going on there that they need to experiment with a whole lot more, and they're kind of scared.
Tiny eyeballs, like in interference, maybe?
That's we know that they can sense light and very sensitively, because some plants use the length of the day to decide when it's time to flower or when it's time to germinate. Others will use the angle of the sunshine. Now, how do they know the angle of the sunshine? They do. And plants can count. I forgot that.
Really?
Yes. Some of them can count quite high. For example, certain bamboo will wait a certain number of years before they flower, and they want to do that in certain kinds of numbers to deal with insects, because if it's only certain irrational numbers, then they can't do that. They can count up to 113. We know that because they'll wait that long. Venus flytrap. So the fly comes and it lands on the little trap, and there are hairs there. And it needs to touch the hairs 3 times within a certain amount of time, and then it will close. The trap will close. So they can count. And we're not sure how, because they don't have a nervous system.
So consciousness in humans is a mystery right now, and it's one of the greatest mysteries. Do you think that plants kind of have the clues? If we make a breakthrough in looking at plants and discovering what you just described, do we get closer to understanding consciousness in ourselves?
Ever wondered what it takes to make it in the movie business? Peel back the curtain with 4-6 Success Filmmaking. 4-6 Success Filmmaking is where filmmakers share their stories and the secrets.
It's beyond competitive out there.
There have been movies that it's taken me 10 years to get made.
Don't wait to create. You've got to just keep making stuff.
Tune into 4-6 Success Filmmaking for your dose of cinematic realness, direct from the voices that have lived it.
I don't know, because plant cells are so different from animal cells that there might not be anything similar. On the other hand, we know that we use chemicals, they use chemicals, but they don't have a nervous system and we have a nervous system. So they propagate things from cell to cell to cell, rather than us, we just send it in a nerve cell and zips through our body, because nerve cells can be many feet long. Or maybe it's just something that every living thing more or less does, some obviously more than others because they're more complex. It's an interesting question and hard to know.
Mm-hmm.
With a blogger who I kind of glommed onto through your site, goes into much greater detail on the ethics around the duology and semiosis, and goes into the moral character of Stevland, the rainbow bamboo. Is Stevland good? Is it sociopathic? Is it, how did you envision the bamboo and what, as a character when you sat down to write this? What did it start out as? Because when you read the book and you start reading the book, you start to wonder, is this the enemy? Like, they've landed on this planet and they've encountered a hostile species, but the species helps them survive on this planet and becomes integral to their ability to thrive there. So how did you first approach this, and did it evolve? And what is your take on the rainbow bamboo now?
I based it on what we know about earth plants, and everything in the book, except for actually thinking like us, earth plants can do. They can't necessarily plan ahead, and that's lucky, or we'd be in trouble. But so one thing we know about trees is that trees are a very social species, and so are we. Trees need to be around other trees to be healthy, as do we. In prison, solitary confinement is torture. And it can make you insane if you're there too long. That works with humans. It's the same, as near as we can tell, with plants, that a plant that is alone, a tree that's growing out on the street and not near other trees, is not as healthy as other trees. And not just because an urban environment is a difficult environment. It's just lonely. So if we have an intelligent plant that is a social species that grew up all alone, what's that going to mean for the plant? And I assumed it would mean something rather similar to what we know about humans, is that Steveland has some real mental health issues. He's not necessarily evil so much as he's desperate. When the glassmakers first come, he finally has some society. I mean, he has the other plants around him, and that they're okay, but they're not quite up to his speed. And the glassmakers were there, and he could communicate with them, or he's starting to. And I was very excited. Then they left, and then he had this mental health crisis. The humans get there, and he does establish communication with them, and he will do anything to keep them, because that's the only thing keeping him sane. He doesn't consciously know this, but he understands it enough to know what he has to do, which is to take care of them and to keep them there, no matter what. And as we know from the book, when things get bad, he does what he needs to do. So is he good? Is he bad? No, I don't want to say human, but he is a social species and it has needs and he has to take care of them.
And he's lost before, right? Like he trusted and the the other species
The
and
glass makers.
the
Oh yeah,
glass makers,
yeah.
right? And then they left, and it's like in a relationship, someone emotionally makes themselves vulnerable and rely on somebody else, and then suddenly they lose that. And so that was Steveland. Poor Steveland is trying to make sure he doesn't lose his next relationship partner.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, we see it's not sociopathic behavior. It's behavior that because a sociopath doesn't care about other people. Steveland cares too much.
It's an interesting thing you do, because it's very rare that you would have an author that makes people where you can anthropomorphize plants and make it believable. So you've obviously through a lot of diligent hard sci-fi effort made it believable, but also you've done a great job of humanizing, but not overly humanizing, this plant in a way that sounds comical. Like it's actually quite well done. And so I mean, obviously that must have been very planned. You must have put a lot of thought into that.
Well, and a lot of research, but one thing I discovered with the research was what helped me write the book. When I knew I had the book, so I wanted to write about intelligent plants on another planet. So I'm reading about how planets form and how they could work. And I discovered that with a little bit, sometimes it happens that a planet could have all of the iron sink to the core. Plants need iron for photosynthesis. So if you have a planet where there's not a lot of iron on the surface, but the plants need iron, well, there's a lot of iron in my blood. There is a problem right there, and we see that in the book, is that rainbow bamboo are a predatory species too, because they have to be, because that's how they can survive. We eat animals, they consume animals. I mean, we eat plants, they consume animals, well, we consume animals too, for the same reason, because they're very nutritious. And so that was, as I did the research and found out how nature actually works, a lot of the plot just took care of itself, and a lot of the moral questions, because we have moral questions in our life that are created by the situation that we're in. Should we eat an octopus? I can tell you they're delicious. I've done it, but I kind of feel guilty. But what do? We need to eat things, and Brussels sprouts do not want to be eaten. Tomatoes are fine with that, but we cannot live on tomatoes alone.
We can't only eat things that want to be eaten. That's right. That is a moral issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to just mention another author we've spoken to who I know, actually, he recommended your book to us, and that's Adrian Tchaikovsky. And there's a similarity between Children of Time and Semiosis. It's beautiful. We
talked about that. We met at the London Worldcon and had a beer and talked about that.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So something that we've actually spoken about this a few times on the show, and Adrian, this is important to him, and it's the word empathy. And just talking about Steveland and about what we were just talking about, is empathy a big part of your writing? Is this, I mean, the octopus? Should we be eating the octopus? Is empathy something that's it just seems to be important in sci-fi right now? It seems to be a strong theme. And where are you when it comes to empathy as a theme and in your writing?
Personally, I think it's very necessary. And in my book, particularly in Semiosis, I didn't want to have a villain so much as just people and entities that were at cross purposes. And at the very end of Children of Time, there is a sentence or that when the spiders understood, or when entities understand each other, then problems are solved. And I was very excited to read that in his book. And I think that's something that's important in mine too. When we understand each other, we can solve a lot of problems.
Yeah. And I think that was really noteworthy because there are parts of the book where you lead the reader to want to hate the glassmakers, when there's an attack and this goes on. And so the reader is really out for blood, or at least some of us. And then you go and Stevelin and the humans are working together, and they're trying to, despite them being beaten upon by the glassmakers, they're still approaching them with empathy. They're still trying to create this coalition. And that was surprising to me. And maybe it shouldn't be, but you just don't see a lot of books that take that approach.
Maybe more should.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed.
I mean, it was definitely an Adrian Tchaikovsky's book, and more than one of his.
Was it a surprise to you both to be like, oh my gosh, I love your book. I love your book too. They're so similar. I love your in some ways.
We had actually been in touch before. We had
Okay.
read each other's books and just arranged to meet each other, as fans do.
What was your path into science fiction? You have a background as a journalist, and I'd like to, maybe the audience would be great for us all to hear sort of how you went from journalism and sort of evolved into science fiction writing.
Well, I always was a fan of science fiction from when I was a child. So I'd been reading it all along. And then but I was doing journalism as well, and I enjoyed that very much. But I lost one job, and I finally had a time to put more effort into fiction. I'd done a little bit of it, and then I got serious. This was the early 1990s, and just started to write and kept writing. Um, I have always loved to write and always loved to read. And then I thought, well, maybe I could write fiction as well.
And you've been doing some translating work too.
Right.
That's kind of unique. How does that inform your own writing?
Yeah. Well, I lived in Spain for 17 years, learned Spanish, and so that I translate from Spanish into English. You can see it in semiosis and interference with the differences in language. Although I have to say, human languages, actual languages, are much more difficult and complex at times than the difference between glassmaker and human, or in interference. Humans come from Earth, and they'd been separated from of the humans on Pax, and it took them a while to figure out that they were speaking the same language, but just very different. So it helped me understand how communication is hard, even within the same species, let alone in other species. Because we know that whales talk to each other. We have no clue as to what they're saying, except that they are. Dolphins are the same. They talk. We don't know what they're saying. We talk. They probably know that we're talking too. But there's very little communication, actual communication between us. Even among humans, getting from one language to another is fraught with errors, sometimes very funny, sometimes not.
And I guess also you get into whatever book you're translating, you'd be very intimately connected with it because you're going to have to read it so much more deeply than most people would. Do you ever find you start to find useful tidbits from writing that you're translating?
Well, I get that out of everything.
Okay. You're a deep reader. That's good.
Yeah, and listening and just things around me. The thing with translating, though, is I'm trying to translate what that author's trying to say into English as if that person were able to write in English in the first place. How would they have said it? Which isn't necessarily the way I would have said it. So I'm trying to get into their head and looking at it from them. What is easiest is if you have a very, very good writer, because you can then write very good English. If you have someone whose original language, they're just not very skilled at it, then ideally would write not very skilled English, and that's unpleasant as a writer and as a
Wow.
translator. So you try to match them.
Hmm.
But sometimes you get into fun things. That I was translating a story into English, and it's now I should remember. Um, he was having an imaginary conversation with an English musician, and I wish I could remember David Bowie, and but it was in Spanish, and I wanted him to sound like David Bowie in English. So I actually found some David Bowie interviews on YouTube and watched them for a while. And how did David Bowie talk in English so that I could make David Bowie sound like David Bowie in English?
Interesting.
None of this is unusual if you're a translator.
Very cool. So what was inspiring you, or what does inspire you? And just going back even just to TV and film, did you see Close Encounters of the Third Kind in the 70s and see that translation with music with the aliens? And was that important to you, or so when it comes to sci-fi books and film, what inspires you or inspired you?
Well, you're talking now about 50, 55 years of reading, as I'm 66, and so I've been at this a while. Yeah, the idea of music as communication, that was not the first place. And even among humans and animals, we do that. I'm more inspired, I think, by ideas than anything else, but all kinds of ideas. You know, what if machines actually had free will? I have a novel coming out next year. And what if you actually had an independent free machine? I'm not the first one to think about this. How would they apply, looking from their point of view at Asimov's three laws? Maybe not the way we would. So taking ideas and for me is where it starts. Other writers start with different places. They might start with characters or a setting. Semiosis started with what if plants could think? And if plants can do all these other things and they could think about it, then what? So that's where I come at it. And I like all sorts of things and I read all sorts of things. But what I get excited about when I sit down to write is ideas.
And you know what? I think a lot of readers get excited about that too. At least I do. I love it when I get those ideas and it really strikes a chord with me. I'll just stop reading for a second, put the book down, and just ponder it. It gets me really excited. Characters are great. Ideas are where it's at. Can you tell us about that independent machine book, the free will one you were just describing?
It's called Dual Memory, and it starts out there's a guy and it's set quite a bit in the future, and there are freebooters, which are essentially pirates, and they're attacking an island, and he wants to defeat them, and they kind of defeat them. He's pretty sure they're coming back, and he's wants to be ready for them. But he wants to fight. He's really sure, and he's right, that there are people on this island that support the freebooters. He doesn't want them to know who he is, so he's trying to sneak around, be a spy, and then he finds help with the island's machines. Because one of the Asimov's laws is a machine has to take care of its own self-preservation. So they do, and they form a partnership, but it is not an equal partnership. And then things happen.
Cool. And so do Isaac Asimov's three laws of robotics play a part in this?
They're mentioned in passing.
Okay.
One of many ideas that goes whizzing by.
Okay.
Set in Chicago in the future?
No, it's on an imaginary island
Ooh.
named Thule. It's up on the Arctic Circle, and it's cold and horrible and snowy, and that came from real life because I grew up in Wisconsin.
Ah.
And you said that one's coming out next year, is that right? 2023?
That comes out, yes, on May of 2023. And Usurpation is May of 2024.
And have those titles, are they going to survive encounters with the publishers, or is that what's going to be for sure?
Yeah, the editor and I have already worked them out.
Oh, great. That's exciting. I like both
Dual
of those
memory.
titles.
Excellent. Is that dual memory that's with Tor as well?
Yes,
Awesome.
these are all with Tor. Tor is a very nice place to work with.
We hear that. We hear that a lot.
So I was looking at also a little more digging from your site, and you mentioned Joanna Russ as an influence, and she wrote during a time when sci-fi was like dominated by dudes, and over the past decade, science fiction has been evolving into a more diverse space that can surface issues related to social change and social justice. And as you're sitting here in front of three white guys, what is your experience as what has been your experience as a writer and a woman writing in this genre as compared to the other areas that you write in? And what is the change that you've seen?
Yeah, well, I was reading Joanna Russ in the 1970s when the Equal Rights Amendment was still, well, it never did pass. When in some ways I was a second-class citizen, I couldn't do a lot of things just because I was female. And she captured the anger of that moment. I like that. And I also was impressed with the big ideas of, okay, this is our real life situation. How can you put that idea into science fiction? And she did. Um, and over time, though, things have changed, and that's very good. And women have been able to find more equality bit by bit, although it's a constant struggle, and we're not there yet. The 60s and 70s was also, I was in the United States, of course, and we had civil rights and a lot of unrest. I saw that happening, tried to be supportive in the ways that I could, and now we're seeing more success. Still, it can be strange. If you talk to a Black writer, they will tell you that they face problems. Who was it I was talking to? Tade Thompson. And so he wrote this book set in Nigeria. And he found it hard to get published because it was in Nigeria. And who wants to read about Nigerians? And I was talking to him, and I've got talking plants. No one thinks that's strange, but talking Nigerians is too much. So it's still an issue. It's still something that I'm pleased to see that there has been progress over the decades, but we need to keep going. And as a white person, what can I do? Well, I can say that Tade Thompson wrote this really great book. He's written other books. There's lots of other good authors out there. I buy them, I read them, I talk about them. And that's what we can do as white people, is to make sure that there's fans, that we're fans of work that is good, that is coming out of from people of other colors and other backgrounds, other experiences. And there's a lot of it out there.
And you're pretty heavily involved, I think, in the science fiction community too. So you have the opportunity to influence. You were mentioning that you're going to be volunteering at Chicon. Is that how you pronounce it?
Chicon.
Chicon.
Yeah.
Chicon.
Watch your mouth, Kevin.
I'm talking about the World Science Fiction Convention in Chicago in September 2022. Yeah, what are you doing there? What are you going to be involved with there?
So far, what I'm doing is helping with publications, and I'm an editor and proofreader of publications, pretty much in the background, and writing a few articles. And then we'll see what we need as things go farther. But I thought, because I know all of grammar rules, and what I don't know, I have the grammar books for. That's something I could do very well.
Do you do that a lot? Is that something that you like to do?
Edit or volunteer
and be involved with the science fiction community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. I enjoy it a lot, especially here in Chicago. It's big. There's Capricorn is a science fiction convention that's happening, and it's going to be in person this year. Last year was all online, but this year we're going to be in person, vaccinated, wearing masks, and they talk about it as a family, and I think it's true. We're it's like going home and seeing all your friends, seeing new friends, a very supportive community. And that's just a good thing because we can share that support with, for example, writers of color who need that, and we can find ways to move that in. Chi-Con 8 is doing some very deliberate things in that way to try to bring in new voices, new languages, because this is in Chicago. It's going to be in English and in Spanish and in Polish, because this is a very big Polish community, and there's Polish science fiction writers. So the community can at its best be a good place to help expand and to help people grow, and I want to do that.
That's fantastic.
So, I mean, if you're doing all that, you're working on the third book in the Semiosis series. What else are you working on, or is there anything else that you're working on?
Let's see. That's it. There's a translation coming up. Two friends of mine in Spain, Sofia Rey and Cristina Jurado, who has done a lot of work, decided that we're going to team up. They put out a call for short stories that deal with non-binary gender and non-binary expression. They've picked out some stories and have picked out one. I'm going to translate it into English and see if we can't get it published in English. But then there's the challenge of how do you do non-binary in Spanish? Spanish has, as a language, has certain resources, and English has certain resources, and moving them from one to another is a delightful challenge for me, but I hope will be good for readers as well.
What do you mean by those resources? Is it the nature of the language that makes non-binary something easier in one language versus the other?
It can be, it can't be. It's the grammar, it's the vocabulary, it's the sentence structure, all those things that go into a language. And each language has different resources and different ways that it deals with things and approaches certain kinds of questions.
Interesting. In particular around gender, I guess, right? If you're genderizing nouns, etc., I could see that being difficult to translate, maybe.
Spanish is a more gendered language because verbs are conjugated. They're fully conjugated. You don't necessarily need a pronoun to go with a verb. So you can go through and just dice. Does that mean he said, she said, it said? You don't know from that one word. So you can not mention gender in some ways that are easier than in English.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing translating. I have such a respect for what you do and other translators. It's such a challenge to try not to impose your own voice on the author, and it's quite the battle, I'm sure.
Well, yeah, the thing about language is that it is our humanity's oldest technology and our most complex technology, because language is nothing except a way to express ideas in a way totally disconnected from them. So it's a technology, it's something that we've created, because nothing about cat means a four-legged furry animal. We have just decided that way. We have built that as an artificial way to express that idea from one person to another.
Or the color green, or, high notes, or pleasurable tastes. They're all very subjective. Yes, I mean, one thing that we haven't heard about Immunity Index, your book Immunity Index. I haven't read it either. Do you want to talk about that for a second?
Okay, so I started writing that in 2018, and I thought, well, epidemics happen. And I did some research and discovered that COVID is a very interesting virus. So what if there was a COVID epidemic? And I wrote a book.
What if that happened? My goodness.
So I don't know if you can see, I have the book here, and there you have the big COVID called Immunity Index, but it is totally different from ours. One way it is different is that at the end of the book, and it's not that long of a novel, it is over. Nobody's getting sick anymore. It's done with. A happy ending because there's an ending. It follows three different women, young women in this. My favorite character is what we call now an essential worker. She hates her job. She hates some of her customers. She definitely hates her boss. She hates the place that she works for. And I know, because I know essential workers, that I invented a real person. And she has to put up with all of this, what happens in the epidemic. There's also woolly mammoth in here. Because because it is an engineered disease. If you can do that, if you can make a woolly mammoth, you can do that, and vice versa. So there's a woolly mammoth and being cared for by another one of these young women, because this is a really sudden epidemic and it's sort of chaotic. And because this woolly mammoth can't take care of itself. It's sort of in a zoo, and then what happens? And loves this animal and doesn't want it to be injured, but she has to keep herself safe. And then there's all sorts of stuff. So it's very different from ours, much more exciting. The bad guys get what they had. There are bad guys in this book, and they get what they have coming from us. Whole thing takes place mostly over just like 3 days rather than 3 freaking years. As a newspaper reporter, I was covering AIDS back in the 1980s. And one day before there was some sort of meeting, I was talking with the Wisconsin State epidemiologist. And so this was AIDS, and AIDS was bad. I want to make that clear. But he was explaining how AIDS was not that bad compared to what could happen. And he started explaining how different kinds of transmissions, different kinds of infections, different kinds of viruses, or bacteria for that matter, different things could have been much, much worse than AIDS. And AIDS was bad enough. And so I remembered that after all the years, is if you think that was bad, well, okay, well, here we are now, arguably worse. But I remembered that, and that was another one of the ways that I had an idea way back from the 1980s, and it always sort of stuck with me. What if something bad happened? How bad could it be?
Isn't it amazing that back in 2018, your idea of a dystopic, pandemic book becomes better than reality?
The only thing I had to add, because I was editing it in the early 2020s, I had to add a run on toilet paper. Did not think of that. But the rest of it, I was doing my research. None of this should be a surprise. All of this was stuff that doctors and researchers knew was going to happen. We could have been prepared, and we are not. We're in this situation now because we made a series of bad choices. But we knew what the good choices could have been. One of the things was that in 1917, of course, there was the Spanish flu, which was really bad. Millions of people died. But in Milwaukee, where I was living, where I grew up, the government there and the city there did a whole bunch of things of caring for people, putting things in place, passing out information. Boy Scouts leafleted the city in all sorts of languages, because this was Milwaukee at the time had one of the highest percentage of immigrants and poor immigrants and bad housing and crowded housing situation. It should have been terrible, but because they worked so hard, Milwaukee had one of the lower death rates of cities in all of the country. It can be done, but you have to want to.
Yeah, it's got to be part of policy, and and governance, and
Mhm.
and part of your infrastructure to and political will, frankly, like to do that. Isn't that the case? Like I think
Mhm.
it's a testament to the impact on social programs and policy and education.
And science fiction is a way that you can explore that kind of idea.
Well, one of the things with
Yeah.
science fiction too that the more we talk to authors like yourself is we learn. I mean, some people seem to read science fiction and want predictions of the future, which it's really not what it's about. It's really about a reflection of today. And would you say your work is a reflection of today in when it comes to politics?
Well, as you said before, empathy is something that is being explored by more people than me. But it was the question that we're dealing with now, is how can different kinds of people form a community? And what would cause that to happen, or what would cause that to fail? hardly a new question, but one that particularly as the world gets smaller and as we get into, I think is going to be a very difficult time in the future. How do we cope with that? And again, this was something that having been in journalism and having sat through an enormous number of governmental meetings and seeing how people tried to cope even with small questions. I remember one once was they needed to buy a half of a garbage truck because they had budgeted half and then they had to budget the next half. And how do they get that money? It sounds like a very small question, and it is, but if you can handle that, you can handle bigger questions, or you can fail to handle that. And it's essentially the same process, just blown up. Do we treat each other well and trying to get to the same end, or do we not? And as we look around, we can see examples of how that works and how that doesn't. In semiosis in particular, I wanted to show people that could work together in spite of problems. And again, in usurpation, there's going to be a moment when it's either we all try to do the right thing, or we could all just may as well give up now because it's going to be the end. And they're going to have to make right decisions and work together, or it fails. And which is what happens in real life too.
So would you say that current situations are going to be reflected in the third book in the duology series?
There's some questions of war. This is after climate change is pretty well taken care of, but they're still dealing with the aftermaths of that. And then the general question of how do we live together in peace or not, which has always been a question.
I hope that we get more lentils in that book because I love the lentils. They made me smile every time they were a part of your books.
I agree. And the tulips.
Yeah, but the lentils, I don't know what the lentils, they were just cute.
Well, I've already decided that if Rainbow Bamboo were to run for president or some office, I'd vote for them.
Well, remember that they are aggressive and believe they should be in charge. They don't necessarily believe in democracy.
No, but if they're benevolent and more intelligent, I mean, we see all sorts of sci-fi out there where we have benevolent AI who runs our societies. Why not a benevolent plant? He seems to be doing a good job on PAX.
Is he though?
You're going to have to read Usurpation.
Oh, okay.
It's never that easy.
Is there such thing as a good king? I mean, just maybe one you can live with at best, but
you're bursting my bubble, Sue. I was hoping for benevolent plant. It's all right.
Philosopher kings, that's been debated a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we can go without asking you what type of sci-fi you've been watching or reading lately, kind of contemporary stuff. Is there something you sit in front of Netflix or Disney Plus, something that tickles your fancy?
Mostly I read, not because there's not good stuff on TV and in movies. I think we're in a golden age.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't because I know that I'm going to be at 6 a.m. going, just one more episode. My husband does that. He watches a lot and I come out and, honey, you should come to bed now. So I read instead because I think it's safer. Right now I'm reading Perhaps the Stars by Ada Palmer, another Chicago author. In fact, I know her. This is the fourth book in that trilogy plus one, and the concluding book. And I've been waiting for a long time. And it's a honking big book, but there's a lot of big ideas in there. And after that, I read all sorts of things. If you ask me for a favorite author, I'd have to give you 20.
That's okay.
I did read Station 11, which is now on TV, I guess. But I read the book during the pandemic, and it's a nice book and not related to our pandemic at all. And very, very beautifully written. I hope the series is as good as the book. If not, read the book.
Okay.
Yeah, the book's been on my radar. I've only heard about it from hearing there was a TV show, and not really going to jump into the TV show until I've read that book, but I hear great things about that one.
I recommend
did,
it.
Yes, I did read it. I can recommend it as well. It's good. Yeah.
What have we not asked you that we should have asked you, Sue? What are we missing?
What do I think makes science fiction different from literary fiction?
Ooh, good one.
Oh,
And I think that if you read literary fiction, it assumes that if you understand yourself, and you understand the world, understand yourself, then you can solve your own problems. And it's very individualistic self-actualization. But if you read science fiction, it it says that we cannot control our lives, no matter what we do. There, even if we understand ourselves perfectly, things are going to happen outside of us, and there's nothing we can do about it. If the Martians land tomorrow, we are doomed if they want to kill us all. And no matter how well we understand each other, we can't solve that. Science fiction looks at what do we need to do to cope, if we can in fact cope. Changes are coming at us in real life faster than we can handle them. Social media has changed our politics in a way that does not seem easy to get out of, and has done some very real harm. We can't control that. And even if we understand ourselves perfectly, it's still going to be out there. If the Martians are out there, what are we going to do? Well, maybe if we have a phaser and we set it on stun, we can stun all of the Martians, and then when they wake up, we can talk about peace. The solutions are not going to come inside of us understanding each other, which is a very individualistic thing. It's going to be a community thing. You can't make a phaser by yourself. We can't solve this problem by ourselves. We're going to have to do it as a group. And I think that you see that in some of the best science fiction. In Adrian Tchaikovsky's book, Children of Ruin. No, Children of Time. That's the first one. Then there's Children of Time. The way the spiders solve the problem is by working together with a goal. No more spoilers than that. But they have something that they want to do, and they need a group to do it, because the humans are a problem that they need to solve, and they do it in a very creative way. And that's an example of how science fiction looks at the exterior world and things outside of us and solves them not by being better spiders, but by being more capable spiders.
So, where would Margaret Atwood fit in that category then of your fiction, science fiction? Because she really seems to cross that, and she's unbelievable with what she's able to accomplish with her books. Is she the middle ground? Does she bring those two together, the science fiction literature, or is she still just perfect prose? Is she literature?
In terms of ideas, she's definitely science fiction, whether she wants to say that or not. And her prose is excellent. Her characterization is excellent. But you can find that in science fiction by people who are very solidly science fiction as well. So that doesn't make her unique. Does Handmaid's Tale? The solution for that in the book is the handmaiden escapes and never really solves anything. I don't know about the TV show because I haven't been watching because I need to sleep. But the book is an individualistic solution to the problem.
Mhm.
Apparently, it does get solved in the end, but we don't know how. So that's a different look at it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's a different way of, and you see that in a lot of science fiction books too, is that they try to take it from an individualistic one. But the handmaiden in that tale does it not by being a better handmaiden or understanding herself better. She does it by getting the hell out, because there's nothing she can do short of escaping. So again, you get the exterior sort of an individualistic solution, but it's not the literary being a better person sort of thing. It's being a better grasp of her situation and knowing that there's only one solution. So I guess I talked my way into saying that, yeah, it's science fiction, no matter what she says.
Yeah, it's funny how it avoids that title. I don't know how that happens.
Well,
Orcs
she
and
wants
Grapes is another
talking
example.
octopuses, and she should read Adrian Tchaikovsky because he has them, and that would in spaceships too. So that would make it science fiction to her, but she just doesn't read enough to know that there's also talking Nigerians.
Interesting.
Yeah, very interesting.
Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for as long as you have as well.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been fun.
Good. It has been for us too. I feel quite privileged to be able to have this conversation, and I think our listeners will as well.
Well, I enjoyed the questions, and well, thank you. If my book does one thing, if it's to make people appreciate plants better, I've done my job.
And entertained us for sure.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll see you at ChiCon.
Well, come on down.
Okay.
You can just get on a boat and get off, and you'll be here.
That's right.
We're 2 lakes over, right? Is that how we do that?
Yeah, 2 lakes.
2 lakes over. So we'll have to find a lock or something, eh?
Just take a hovercraft. That would work.
There you go.
Yeah.
Or portage, walk the canoe through.
Oh, yeah.
There's shipping. I know there's a way.
There's a way. Thank you, listeners, for joining us today, and thank you so much, Sue. That was fantastic. Check out Sue's website. Link is in the description of this episode. We also want to have the time to say thank you to people out there who have written reviews or rated us online. We really appreciate hearing from you. Connect with us on Twitter or email. We want to keep the good content coming, so hearing from you really helps. Okay, until next time.